Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into some listener-submitted material focusing on the war on terrorism.
Right.
We're going to unpack its origins, how it evolved, and its consequences, particularly in the Middle East.
And beyond, yeah. Our main source here is Scott Horton's book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism.
Exactly. And our mission really is to look beyond the sort of common narratives surrounding this long conflict.
To see if we can uncover some maybe surprising insights, get a clearer picture of what's been going on.
Yeah. So for you, the learner, we're aiming for a solid but digestible understanding.
Right. The historical context, the often unintended outcomes of U.S. involvement.
Giving you knowledge that hopefully goes a bit deeper than the usual headlines and encourages some critical thinking.
Okay, let's jump in.
So one of the first big things the book challenges is this idea that 9/11 was like the starting pistol.
An unprovoked assault from the quote-unquote Muslim world.
Yeah. Horton argues U.S. intervention in the Middle East goes back way further.
And that this intervention is actually a major cause, maybe the primary cause, of anti-American terrorism.
It's a provocative idea.
Definitely. And it frames 9/11 differently, too. Not as the start, but maybe a desperate act.
How so?
Well, the book suggests it was carried out by a pretty small group of Arab fighters.
Some of whom, ironically, had received U.S. backing before in other conflicts.
Precisely. And their goal, Horton argues, wasn't necessarily to, destroy America, but more to destabilize their own countries by provoking a massive U.S. intervention.
Wow, okay. That really flicks the script.
It does. And it connects to another point, what actually motivates this anti-American feeling.
Right. Is it just they hate our freedoms, this idea of radical Islam?
Or is it something more concrete? The book brings in Michael Scheuer here. He ran the CIA's bin Laden unit for a while.
And his take.
His emphasis was that bin Laden focused recruitment on very specific destructive U.S. policies in Arab nations.
So tangible things people could point to, not abstract ideology.
Exactly. Scheuer pointed out, back in the 80s, when someone like Khomeini criticized American culture, it didn't really spark widespread violence against the U.S.
But bin Laden tapped into something different.
Real grievances about actual U.S. actions. That was far more effective for recruitment, apparently.
Okay. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict also factors in heavily, right, as a recruitment tool.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Horton points to it as a major one for al-Qaeda.
But it's not just about bin Laden's personal stance against Israel's existence.
No. What's interesting is the book notes that many regional governments, even including Hamas at certain points, have indicated they'd be willing to talk peace.
Based on pre-67 borders? A two-state solution.
Yeah, those parameters have been on the table from various actors over the years.
So the argument is, if Palestinian independence were somehow achieved,
a huge chunk of al-Qaeda's recruitment narrative might just evaporate.
Interesting. Is there precedent for that?
Well, the book mentions Hezbollah stopping attacks after Israel pulled out of Lebanon in 2000. It's presented as a related example.
So the core issue, according to Horton, is ongoing foreign military presence, which gets blamed on the U.S.
Right. And the costs aren't just financial aid to Israel. It's argued this contributes to the loss of American lives, too.
This whole line of argument really pushes back against the broad brush idea of radical Islamic extremism.
Definitely. The book stresses, there were 1.6 billion Muslims globally. The number fighting for bin Laden was tiny in comparison.
And it distinguishes between religious fundamentalism and political violence.
Exactly. It says most Salafi or Wahhabi fundamentalists, the groups often linked ideologically to al-Qaeda, are actually quietists.
Yeah.
Meaning they focus on faith, not terrorism or political upheaval.
Yeah.
They're not interested in that.
And didn't a Gallup poll confirm bin Laden lacked widespread support?
Yes. The book cites Who Speaks for Islam.
Oh.
It found bin Laden didn't have significant backing among most Muslims or Arabs.
So despite his claims, he wasn't really speaking for them.
The evidence suggests not, no. His political project didn't resonate widely.
Okay, so if it's not primarily religion, what else? The book brings in Robert Pape's work.
Right. Pape studied suicide terrorism extensively. Since 1980. Every single instance.
And his conclusion?
The single biggest predictor. Foreign combat forces on the attacker's perceived homeland.
So the goal is coercion. Get the troops out.
That's Pape's argument. Self-sacrifice is a strategic coercive tactic.
And didn't MI5 find something similar?
Yeah, a 2008 UK study pointed to perceived injustice and a sense of powerlessness as key drivers.
It really puts the focus back on political and social circumstances, doesn't
It
it?
really does. Tangible factors, not just abstract beliefs.
Let's rewind a bit then. Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s, the Soviet invasion.
A pivotal moment. The book recounts the U.S. starting covert aid to the Afghan Mujahideen back in '79.
And it suggests this aid was partly intended to lure the Soviets in.
That's the controversial claim, yeah. Figures like Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, seem to imply they wanted a Soviet Vietnam.
Was the U.S. aid the deciding factor for the Soviets?
That's debated. Afghanistan was already unstable. But the U.S., Saudis, Pakistan, they all poured support into the Mujahideen afterwards.
Including those international Islamic brigades, the Arab Afghans.
Yes. Fighters from all over the Middle East, even some from the West, recruited to fight the Soviets.
And that support had long-term consequences.
Massive ones. Many of those fighters later formed the core of groups like Al-Qaeda. Classic blowback.
Okay, another key event, the Iranian Revolution, 78-79. The book links this back to earlier U.S. actions, too.
Absolutely. It points to the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, CIA, MI6, driven largely by British oil interests.
And after that, the U.S. backed the Shah for decades.
For 26 years, yeah. An authoritarian regime. The book argues this support bred resentment and created the conditions for the '79 revolution.
One that brought the Ayatollahs to power.
Right. And ironically, the Carter administration apparently approved Khomeini's return from exile. They initially saw him as potentially useful.
Useful. Against who?
Well, partly because he'd opposed Mossadegh earlier. And some, like Zalmay Khalilzad later, saw the revolution as maybe problematic for the Soviets.
Okay, moving to the 90s, the first Gulf War. Iraq invades Kuwait.
The book highlights the sort of mixed signals the U.S. sent Saddam beforehand.
Yeah.
Ambassador Glaspie's comments.
Did the U.S. expect the full invasion?
Apparently not entirely. Some in the administration thought it might be a more limited land grab. The scale of it shifted the U.S. response dramatically.
And the justification for the war. Comparisons to Hitler, threats to the American way of life.
All that was part of the narrative. But the book also details the brutal reality of the war itself.
Like the Iraqi troops buried alive, targeting civilian infrastructure.
Yes, and Pentagon officials basically admitted targeting infrastructure was meant to amplify the sanctions' effect, pressure the population to overthrow Saddam.
Grim stuff.
Very.
Interestingly, even with post-Cold War U.S. dominance, some voices urged restraint. Jean Kirkpatrick.
Yeah, a former prominent neoconservative, actually. She argued the U.S. should become a normal country. Focus on its own security, not try to run the world.
A path not taken, clearly. What about the alleged plot to kill George H.W. Bush?
A key justification for the later dual containment policy. But the book points out after the 2003 invasion, no evidence of that plot was ever found.
Still, it fueled the Clinton administration's policy towards Iraq and Iran from '93 onwards.
It did. Along with lobbying from various groups, including pro-Israel voices, there was some internal skepticism, but dual containment won out.
And this fit with the Pentagon needing new threats after the Soviets collapsed?
Seems so. Rogue states with missiles, like Iran, became a focus.
And Israel's political stance towards Iran shifted too.
Yeah, even though some Israeli leaders had seen Iran as friendly just years before, this shift helped block potential peace moves and justified keeping U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia.
Which brings us to the sanctions on Iraq, devastating according to the book.
Catastrophic. Intentionally so, the author argues, designed to make civilians suffer to pressure the regime.
Studies showed massive malnutrition, child mortality.
Yes, numerous studies documented it throughout the 90s. Some U.S. officials even reportedly acknowledged civilian deaths were part of the strategy.
In this context, the sanctions, the U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, this is what turned those Arab-Afghan fighters against the U.S.
That's the core argument. Osama bin Laden, a veteran of the anti-Soviet war, was enraged by the Kuwait intervention, especially U.S. troops on Saudi soil. Holy land, in his view.
So he shifts focus. Early attacks, Mir Khan's assassination, Yemen hotel bombings.
Yes, attributed to groups that would morph into Al-Qaeda. And the CIA was apparently aware of bin Laden's growing role early on.
But opportunities were missed. The '93 WTC bombing.
The book suggests FBI infighting might have prevented them from stopping Ramzi Youssef, the bomb maker.
And Yusuf's stated motives. U.S. support for Israel, the Iraq sanctions.
Right, tying back to those tangible grievances again.
What about the Saudi bombings? Khobar towers.
Initially, the blame was often directed at Iran. But later evidence pointed strongly to bin Laden. Horton suggests this misdirection clouded public understanding of the real threat.
And yet, even as this threat grew, the U.S. was still using similar groups elsewhere, Bosnia, Kosovo.
Yeah, backing Mujahideen affiliates, even with al-Qaeda ties, if they opposed Russian-aligned Serbs. Supporting the Libyan Islamic fighting group against Gaddafi, too.
It seems like a pattern of using these groups as proxies, despite the risks.
That's a major theme Horton emphasizes, the complex, often contradictory nature of U.S. policy in the region.
Okay, fast forward to post-9/11, the Bush administration's focus, it shifted away from just getting bin Laden.
The book argues yes, quite quickly. Rumsfeld even reportedly worried that defeating al-Qaeda specifically would end the wider war on terrorism.
So the claim is they deliberately didn't prioritize capturing him.
There's circumstantial evidence presented suggesting resources weren't fully allocated for that. Regime change in Afghanistan became the priority.
Even though the Taliban leader Mullah Omar wasn't exactly bin Laden's biggest fan.
Correct. He reportedly resented bin Laden's presence.
And Pakistan's role, playing both sides.
The book states Pakistan's ISI actively supported the Afghan Taliban insurgency from around 2005, providing safe havens while still being a major U.S. ally.
A complex relationship, to say the least.
Understatement. U.S. dependence on Pakistan for logistics hampered efforts to address that duplicity.
Then there's the Pentagon's long war strategy.
Right. A vision for basically indefinite counterinsurgency across a huge swath of the globe, West Africa to the Philippines.
Justified by strategic positioning near Iran, Russia.
That was part of the rationale. But the book warns these bases could easily become flashpoints, trigger wider wars.
Which brings us to Iraq War II, the 2003 invasion, decided quickly after 9/11.
Very quickly, the book argues, despite no credible link between Saddam and al-Qaeda.
Driven by neoconservative ideas, reshaping the Middle East, believing it would be easy.
All of the above. Plus, potential financial motives for figures like Cheney via Halliburton. And Rumsfeld saw it as a test case for his military transformation ideas.
But there was opposition.
Significant opposition. From money-prominent thinkers, millions of ordinary people protesting.
The clean break document gets mentioned. Influential.
It illustrates the thinking. Weakening Syria, maybe putting a Hashemite king in Iraq, all supposedly beneficial to Israel, based on flawed assumptions.
And Ahmed Chalabi feeding bad intel.
Him and his Iraqi National Congress played a key role in providing false information about WMDs.
Figures in Israel, like Sharon, actively pushed for war too, and wanted Iran next.
The book details Sharon's efforts to manufacture intelligence and his desire for the U.S. to deal with Iran after Iraq.
And the specific false claims. Aluminum tubes, Russian smuggling chemical weapons.
All part of the narrative built to justify the invasion.
Including using torture to get false confessions linking Iraq and al-Qaeda.
Yes, the case of Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi is highlighted. Tortured into saying things the CIA analysts themselves doubted.
Even Joe Biden's role in pushing the war authorization is noted.
Despite some apparent initial skepticism, yes. The government narrative linking Iraq to 9/11, however tenuous, persuaded a majority of Americans.
And the great irony, the war massively strengthened Iran's influence.
Precisely. A huge strategic miscalculation, according to the analysis.
General Odom called it the greatest strategic disaster in U.S. history.
That quote really captures the assessment presented in the book. Wasted resources, lives lost, no positive strategic outcome.
Contrasting the spreading democracy narrative with the post-invasion chaos.
Yeah. And Bremer's decisions disbanding the army, de-Baathification, are framed as disastrous mistakes that fueled the insurgency and empowered Shiite factions.
Chalabi manipulating the neocons, who later felt duped.
That whole saga is covered. Missed diplomatic chances with Iran, too. False accusations against Iran after the Riyadh bombing. Using the MEK against Iran.
What about the Israeli view on Iran's nuclear program? Not just fearing a first strike.
The book suggests Israeli concerns were more about maintaining their freedom of action in the region and fears of a brain drain than an imminent existential threat.
And the Iran nuclear deal already addressed proliferation concerns.
That's the argument. The JCPOA provided a framework to prevent weaponization.
Then there's the torture, Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. No real accountability.
A major focus. Widespread torture, graphically detailed, with high-ranking officials escaping consequences. Horton argues this might have created some of the worst terrorists.
And the overall destruction in Iraq. Civilian deaths, minority communities decimated.
Just devastating. Near eradication of ancient Christian communities, other minorities, cites soldier testimonies from collateral damage.
Okay, the war expands. Somalia, 2006. U.S. encourages an Ethiopian invasion.
To oust the Islamic Courts Union? Yeah. Pretext was the alleged presence of 3 al-Qaeda suspects from the '98 embassy bombings.
Even though some saw stability under the Islamic courts.
Some libertarian economists noted economic improvement during Somalia's stateless period. But the U.S. backed the invasion with air power, causing civilian casualties.
Then Obama and the Afghanistan surge. He escalated despite private doubts.
Seems so. Pressure from generals, think tanks, media pushed for this big Koyan strategy. He sent tens of thousands more troops.
But the surge failed. Didn't secure Helmand or Kandahar?
Ultimately, no. Pashtun resistance, the local nature of the Taliban, insider attacks. It didn't achieve its goals.
And the Afghanistan papers later confirmed officials knew it was unwinnable.
Exactly. Revealed widespread awareness within the government that the war was a lost cause.
Obama also ramped up the drone war.
Hugely expanded under Obama and John Brennan, often sold as low cost, low risk.
Despite opposition from some intelligence figures and civilian casualties.
Admiral Dennis Blair raised concerns. And yes, significant civilian deaths in Pakistan, often underestimated. Children killed.
Unintended consequences, too. Spreading al-Qaeda.
Right. Killing leaders in one place sometimes just caused fighters to relocate and pop up elsewhere.
Let's look at the Arab Spring in 2011. U.S. responses varied. Egypt.
U.S. had been training pro-American forces there. Then the military coup against the elected Muslim Brotherhood government received tacit U.S. support.
Al-Zawahiri saw that as proof democracy doesn't work for Islamists.
Reportedly gloated about it, yeah. Said it proved al-Qaeda's point against Western democracy.
Meanwhile, protests crushed in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, often with U.S. gear.
The book highlights that hypocrisy, supporting numerous unelected regimes across the region in 2011.
Then Libya, 2011. Why the intervention? Gulf allies had issues with Gaddafi.
Animosity towards Gaddafi, Qatar backing the Muslim Brotherhood there. McCain flipped from supporting Gaddafi to pushing for war.
Samantha Power, Susan Rice, pushed the responsibility to protect angle, preventing genocide.
Yes, invoking Rwanda, despite the Iraq experience, arguably counseling caution.
And Obama's decision was close. Gates said 51-49, Clinton pushed him.
That's Gates' account. Suggests deep division and maybe questionable necessity.
A negotiated exit for Gaddafi was blocked. They wanted him gone.
Seems that way. Saif Gaddafi warned about the rebel forces, and the U.S. and allies ended up backing jihadist militias against Gaddafi.
Even though they knew their history.
Apparently. Policy justified post-talk by figures like Slaughter and Power, despite the ongoing chaos, the refugee crisis.
Benghazi happened in that chaos, and reports of weapons flowing to Syria.
Both mentioned as consequences or related events.
And the instability spread to Mali?
Yes. Tuareg fighters returning from Libya with weapons-fueled insurgency there. U.S. gave clandestine support to a coup regime. French intervened. Ongoing mess. Another coup later.
And Boko Haram in Nigeria got a boost from Mali.
Received indoctrination, weapons, training there in 2013, according to the book. U.S. Special Forces advisors were present in Nigeria, too. Some casualties reported.
Okay, Syria. The book talks about a redirection after Iraq War II strengthened Iran's allies.
Right. Some neocons then wanted a Sunni turn. A memo by Jamie Rubin advocated intervening in Syria to weaken Iran and Hezbollah for Israel's benefit.
And extremist groups were involved in the Syrian uprising from the start.
Yes, like Ahrar al-Sham, founded by early al-Qaeda figures. The Free Syrian Army initially included fighters who'd fought U.S. troops in Iraq.
U.S. Special Forces were on the ground early, late 2011.
A leaked Stratfor memo suggested so. Recon, training opposition forces to topple Assad. Clinton kept pushing for regime change, blocking diplomacy.
And the U.S. and allies supported jihadists, including al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's affiliate.
Openly acknowledged links, but the priority was opposing Assad because of his Iran alliance.
So, fighting al-Qaeda in Iraq while backing them or similar groups in Syria?
The exact paradox Horton highlights.
Obama later called arming moderate rebels a fantasy.
He did. Tulsi Gabbard opposed it too, based on her Iraq experience fighting al-Qaeda allies.
Then the Sunni insurgency split, ISIS emerged in 2013.
Right.
And the U.S. intervention against ISIS in 2014, Horton argues it was unnecessary.
Yeah, the argument is ISIS was surrounded by enemies, its own extremism would likely doom it.
Michael Oren controversially suggested preferring ISIS to Assad because of Iran.
A stark example of the hostility towards Iran overriding other concerns.
The anti-ISIS air war killed thousands of civilians.
Devastating impact estimates are high.
And the U.S. policy was contradictory. Weaken Assad, but not too much.
A tightrope walk. leading to awkward moments like conceding Assad controlling Palmyra was better than ISIS controlling it.
Because ISIS was part of the anti-Assad opposition the U.S. was, in ways, supporting.
Exactly. And the U.S. refused to clearly distinguish al-Nusra from the broader opposition.
Russia intervened overtly in 2015 because ISIS threatened Damascus.
That was the trigger, yes.
And al-Nusra was loyal to al-Qaeda, makes the support questionable.
Highly questionable rationale, according to the book. It also raises doubts about the evidence for alleged chemical attacks blamed on the government.
Clashes between U.S.-backed Kurds and CIA-backed rebels.
Instances of that happened, yeah. Highlighting the fragmented, chaotic policy.
The U.S. allied with Kurdish YPG-SDF against ISIS and Raqqa, knowing Turkey would target them later.
Yes, a known consequence. And Turkey reportedly recruited fleeing ISIS fighters to use against the Kurds.
Trump talked about withdrawal, but faced establishment backlash.
Constantly. Conflicting statements, huge pressure against leaving Syria.
Potential for future conflict in western Iraq. Sunni federalism.
Discussed as a possible source of instability.
And the near war with Iran in early 2020, after Soleimani's assassination.
A very tense moment. Plus, reports of ISIS fighters ending up in Ukraine.
Wow. Okay, Yemen. Obama's 2009 surge included escalation there, too.
Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen all saw escalation around that time. The underpants bomber incident is recounted, too.
And Intel let him travel for surveillance.
That's the claim.
John Kiriakou, the ex-CIA officer, called the drone program a recruiting tool.
Yes, potent recruitment for terrorist groups.
U.S. alliances in Yemen shifted, first with Houthis against AQAPP.
Initially, yes. Then Obama reversed, siding with al-Qaeda-linked forces against the Houthis.
Even though the Houthis tried for a representative government and peace with Saudi Arabia initially.
Before the Saudi intervention in March 2015, yes.
And the Obama admin knew the Yemen war would be bad, but supported it to placate the Saudis over the Iran deal.
That's the reported rationale. Internal assessment. Long, bloody, and indecisive, but politically necessary for the Iran deal. Ambiguity remains about the exact U.S. support provided.
And AQAP benefited UAE integrating them, giving them U.S. vehicles.
Reports suggest AQAP gained ground. CNN reported the UAE gave U.S. armored vehicles to al-Qaeda elements. Again, U.S. indirectly aiding al-Qaeda.
Trump blamed Iran for Yemen, but the Houthis weren't initially Iranian proxies.
Horton argues they weren't dependent on Iran, didn't take orders. Yemen has loads of weapons anyway. Claims of massive Iranian arms shipments are debunked. Plus, political and religious differences exist.
And Saudi Arabia deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, causing famine, a war crime.
That's the charge. Deliberate targeting leading to catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Cholera, diphtheria, hundreds of thousands dead, mostly children, from war-induced deprivation.
So Trump didn't start new wars, but didn't end old ones either.
Pretty much. Troops remain deployed widely. Credit for the Afghan deal, but criticism for maximum pressure on Iran. Pro-Israel moves on Jerusalem, settlements, Golan.
Biden promised to end the Yemen war, rejoin the Iran deal. Obstacles remain.
Promises made, but potential roadblocks exist. Early signals showed continued Saudi support.
U.S. military still heavily engaged in Africa, training forces against jihadists.
Ongoing presence. Raising questions about the U.S. role in picking winners and losers there seems likely to continue.
Described as team-building exercises for alliances, keeping funding flowing.
That cynical view is presented. Plus, the shift to countering China in the Pacific, potentially driving more military spending and tension.
What about the impact back home, in Western countries? Supporting extremists abroad doesn't keep us safe.
Horton argues no. Cites foot-hood shooter Nidal Hassan as possible blowback.
The Orlando nightclub shooter pledged allegiance to al-Nusra and ISIS, not just homophobia.
Suggests a complex motivation linked to those groups.
Challenges the narrative of foiled plots, too. Suggests many were FBI entrapment.
Yes, raises questions about the effectiveness and ethics of entrapment, like the backfired Garland, Texas case. Potential failure to stop Boston bombing while focused elsewhere.
Obama's drone assassinations, including U.S. citizens, secret legal justifications.
Highlighted as major expansions of executive power. Plus, the NDAA provision for indefinite detention.
Militarization of domestic police, SWAT raids, military gear.
Seen as a direct consequence of the war on terrorism mindset bleeding into domestic policing. Drone surveillance over U.S. cities, protests.
Overreach of the national security state, alleged framing of Trump.
Mentioned as examples of potential abuses.
High veteran suicide rates. Veterans opposing the wars.
A tragic consequence. And their voices often call for ending these conflicts.
And the economic cost. Trillions.
$6–7 trillion, maybe more. Lost opportunities, destroyed wealth.
masked by low interest rates and inflation.
The book argues the Federal Reserve's policies hid the true cost via monetary inflation, hurting ordinary people.
The Iron Triangle, or deep state, perpetuating the war for profit.
Military intelligence, arms manufacturers, think tanks funded by contractors, all having an interest in continuing the conflicts. Foreign government influence, too, like Saudi donations.
The book argues the U.S. is now seen as mercenary killers, even by liberals.
A harsh assessment of the damage to America's image and values, democracy spreading as a smokescreen for supporting undemocratic allies.
The meaning of freedom distorted to mean license and power over others.
Losing its original sense of liberty and self-governance, quotes John Quincy Adams' warning against becoming the dictatress of the world.
So, the ultimate conclusion: U.S. intervention made terrorism worse.
That's Horton's central thesis.
The way forward is to stop intervening, stop creating failed states.
Exactly. Don't destabilize governments. Don't create lawless territories where these groups thrive.
Undermine the ISIS gray zone concept.
Right. ISIS wants to eliminate peaceful coexistence by provoking crackdowns. The best counter is upholding liberty and justice, not becoming like them.
Okay, wrapping up. Key takeaways from this deep dive.
Well, the core argument that U.S. intervention is a primary driver of anti-American terror. Limited actual support for extremists in the Muslim world. Devastating costs of the Afghan and Iraq wars. Unintended rise of ISIS. Shifting alliances, proxy wars. Huge human and economic costs.
A complex picture, definitely not the simple narrative we often hear.
Far from it.
Which leads to a final thought for you, the learner. Considering all this, how might a real shift in U.S. policy, prioritizing diplomacy, non-intervention, actually change things?
Could it alter the conflicts, the terror threat, and what's our responsibility as citizens to critically examine the stories we're told about these global issues?
Food for thought. For a much deeper understanding, we strongly encourage you to check out Scott Horton's book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism.
And definitely research the events and people we discussed today from various independent sources.
Also, check out the resources at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org for more analysis. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.